The opening line of the Gettysburg Address is known as the reshaping feature of the United States. Throughout statehood, the United States battled against racial inequality, economic downturn, and political unrest. Judge Frank M. Johnson Jr. frontiered the legal underpinnings for dismantling inequalities in the South. Throughout his professional career, Judge Johnson issued decisions that dismantled state-mandated segregation and led Alabama through a series of revolutionary reforms that transformed the legal system, thus impacting the lives of millions of Americans. Ultimately, Judge Johnson frontiered reforms regarding equal opportunity employment, the living conditions for prison inmates, voting rights, affirmative action, and the rights of mentally disabled patients. His bold stance and long-lasting contributions to American governance will be continually recognized by branches of the legal system and felt by many U.S. citizens regardless of race, ethnicity, and gender. Throughout the 19th century, the United States experienced tremendous growth and prosperity with the rise of the Industrial Revolution and the expansion of communication between the East and the West. While this had many advantages, such as the connectivity of regions and the spreading of new ideas and technologies, it caused large discrepancies between the northern and southern regions. Manufacturing was well established in the north, and the citizens relied on the south for agriculture and raw materials, while in the South, the economy was based on large plantation farming dependent on the labor of black enslaved people, who grew cash crops such as tobacco, sugar, and cotton. During this time, slavery grew from 1.1 million in 1810 to 3.9 million in 1860. During the Civil War, according to the 1860 census, it was estimated that 89% of African Americans lived in slavery. There were approximately 31 million Americans, of which 4 million were enslaved. After the war ended in 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, outlawing slavery in the United States. Reconstruction began with the formation of smaller Republican parties in the South. These political factions often included carpetbaggers, Unionists, and newly freed enslaved people. The newly formed factions coincided with regional enforcement of Jim Crow laws, a system of racial segregation and discrimination that significantly impacted African Americans' daily lives and opportunities, including limited access to education, employment, and public spaces. The ideals of this Reformation period carried over to the civil rights movements and political speeches and actions of the next century. In 1918, Frank M. Johnson was born in Haleyville, Alabama, and grew up in Winston County. Throughout the 1800s, this county became a Unionist stronghold. Through his Republican representation, Johnson worked his way up to his position in the Alabama District Court. The Civil War stirred up questions about the meaning and interpretation of freedom and how it could be given to American citizens. These questions would become the legacy of Judge Frank M. Johnson Jr. Johnson took on roles that eventually led him to the Republican National Convention. After attending the University of Alabama, he met future Alabama Governor George C. Wallace. Often, the two would debate over school segregation. In 1943, Judge Johnson enlisted in the Army, where he received the Purple Heart and attracted press attention for representing defense counsel for brutalized soldiers who implicated commanding officers. Johnson cited General Eisenhower to investigate brutality charges and accused the Major General of failing to carry out his duties. His attitude and desire to speak the truth would become a recurring career theme. In 1952, after leading Eisenhower's presidential campaign in Alabama, Johnson was appointed U.S. Attorney for the state's Northern District by General Brownell. 3 years later, he was appointed by Eisenhower as Middle District Judge at the age of 37. This made him the youngest federal judge in the country.
Never looked on any desegregation case with the moral standards in mind. I wasn't hired to be a moral judge. I wasn't hired to be a preacher or an evangelist. I was hired to apply the law.
Soon after his appointment, Johnson faced an immediate test when an Alabama law permitting the segregation of buses was challenged in court. In the hearing of Rosa Parks that later became known as Browder v. Gale, Johnson played a crucial role in deciding the frontier of segregation in Alabama. He recalls telling the presiding judge, Richard Reeves, that the law was clear and did not tolerate discrimination based on race. He explained that segregation violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Judge Reeves agreed in a 2-1 decision that the U.S. Supreme Court later upheld. In the case of Lee v. Macon County Board of Education in 1963, Johnson issued the first statewide school desegregation law. This decision was the frontier for all following rulings that struck down barriers to voting and extended the constitutional protection for prison inmates and those with mental disorders. On March 7, 1965, state troopers assaulted a 600-person civil rights demonstration of freedom riders and other civil rights marchers. This event became known as Bloody Sunday, and Johnson was motivated to order that U.S. Route 80 be opened for the Selma to Montgomery March. This declaration came with consequences, such as public disapproval, threats, and political turmoil, but the unforgettable march would lead to the peak of the civil rights movement, the Voting Rights Act. In 1965, Johnson tested the limits of the next frontier, voting rights. He helped strike down literacy tests and other unfair practices. He ordered voting registrars to use consistent standards for everyone regardless of race and status. On August 6, 1965, Lyndon B. Johnson enacted the Voting Rights Bill as the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The act aimed to overcome barriers at the federal and local levels that prevented minorities from freedom. The Voting Rights Act is considered one of the most far-reaching civil rights legislation in history. Federal marshals protected Judge Frank M. Johnson for 15 years due to the controversy in opposition. Despite facing death threats and personal attacks, he remained committed to justice. His former law school classmate, George C. Wallace, called Johnson an integrating, scalawagging, carpetbagging liar, followed by the Ku Klux Klan calling him the most hated man in Alabama. By the late 1900s, legally sanctioned segregation was starting to be systematically dismantled. With the NAACP v. Dothard case, Johnson required that the state of Alabama hire one African American state trooper for every white state trooper until racial parity was achieved. As his cases became precedent for others, greater minority representation was given in law enforcement and other sectors of the economy. As higher courts affirmed these decisions, social equality became the basis for civil law and a transformed American society that had previously seemed unimaginable. Despite the continued controversy, Judge Johnson emerged as one of the nation's most admired and respected jurists. In 1979, he was appointed judge in the Court of Appeals in the Fifth Circuit. Through his landmark rulings in 1950s and 1960s, played a crucial role in securing the legal grounding needed to make the goals of the civil rights movement permanent. His decisions set important legal precedent that continued to shape the civil rights law. His legacy had a lasting impact on American society, promoting equality and justice for all. To this day, Johnson's measures to protect prisoners' rights are still seen. Many states have taken on bills to allow felons the right to vote. Furthermore, Johnson's rulings, which struck down discriminatory laws and practices, paved the way for current-day human rights demonstrations. The legal victories he helped achieve emboldened activists and reiterated that change was possible through peaceful protests and the courts. This is seen today in the reproductive rights advocacy that enables people to have greater autonomy, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement that strives to expand frontiers in education, law enforcement, healthcare, and equity.
And also the rights not only of African Americans, but the rights of women, the rights of mental illness patients, and also the rights of prisoners. Whenever there were downtrodden people who were suffering from the adverse consequences of a law, Frank Johnson was a heroic rescuer.
Judge Johnson explored and tested the limits of civil rights legislation as he broke ground in desegregating Alabama transportation, public schools, and the entire state. He overturned centuries of oppressive law and ensured that his marginalized citizens would feel secure and could experience the same freedoms as their neighbors. He never wavered in his commitment to justice and the rule of law while facing threats, attacks, and intense pressure. His courage and integrity inspires generations, and his contributions to a new frontier in civil rights won't be forgotten. Johnson's legacy serves as a reminder that the United States were formed on liberty and equality. It must be understood that it is up to every individual to support and establish the law.